Landlord evicts tenant, then learns it's Elon Musk in disguise. The late afternoon sun had started its slow descent, casting a honey-gold glow over the crumbling brick of the aging apartment complex. From the outside, it was a tired building in a tired neighborhood, the kind of place where paint peeled lazily from door frames and the hum of old window AC units filled the air like white noise. It wasn't much to look at, but for those who called it home, it was better than nothing. Rent was cheap, the neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and the landlord, Mr. Graham, ran things with the type of detached authority that came with having too many tenants to remember. But today, something about the building, or maybe the air itself, felt different. Mr. Graham shuffled through the narrow hallway on the second floor, gripping the eviction notice in his left hand, a crumpled wad of keys jingling from his belt loop. His face, flushed and weathered, was fixed in a scowl as he stopped outside apartment 2C. A bent number hung on the door, as if even the metal was giving up. Graham's thick knuckles rapped against the wood hard enough to make the old hinges creak. "Hey, you got 5 minutes to open up." His voice echoed with the authority of someone who'd done this 100 times before. There was no response. Graham ground his teeth, rocking back on his heels as he looked over the door like a predator sizing up prey. He hated this part of the job, not for any noble reason, but because people always tried to argue. They whined about rent being late, lost jobs, medical bills, or it's just a few days, Mr. Graham. He'd heard every excuse imaginable, and today was no different. Except this tenant, the guy in 2C, was unusual. No one knew much about him. He was a quiet loner who had moved in 3 months earlier with a wad of cash for the deposit and first month's rent. He never made noise, never had visitors, and barely said 2 words to anyone. People just called him the weird guy in the hoodie because he always wore the same black hoodie pulled low over his face when he came and went. His rent had been late twice before, but this month, the envelope never even made it to Graham's mailbox. "Last warning," Graham barked, pounding the door again. Inside, there was a shuffling sound, barely audible, like someone moving cautiously. Graham's ears perked up. He curled his lip into a sneer and reached into his pocket, pulling out his master key. "Fine, have it your way." The lock turned with a metallic click, and Graham shoved the door open, stepping inside with the kind of forced authority he always put on for these moments. The apartment, small, cramped, and sparsely furnished, was quiet. Too quiet. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if disturbed. The only noise was the faint buzz of electricity and Graham's own heavy breathing as he looked around. "Hey, where are you?" The man was sitting on a worn couch, facing away from the door. The hoodie was up, just as people described, his hands resting in his lap. There was something unsettling about how still he was, like a statue someone had forgotten to put away. Graham cleared his throat, stepping further into the room. "You're 3 weeks late on rent, pal. I gave you a notice. No money, no apartment. You know how this works." The man didn't move. "You listening to me? I'm not gonna say it again." Finally, the tenant shifted. Slowly, deliberately. He tilted his head just enough for Graham to catch a glimpse of his face beneath the hood. It wasn't much, just the sharp angle of his jawline, the edge of a shadowed cheekbone. But for a split second, Graham paused. There was something familiar about him, though he couldn't place it. "I don't have it yet," the man said quietly. His voice was calm, even the kind of calm that made Graham's irritation spike. "Just give me another week." Graham snorted, shaking his head. "Not gonna happen. You don't pay, you don't stay. I've got a waiting list for this place. People who actually have the money to live here." The man sighed, his hands, pale, slender, tightened just a fraction on his knees. "Fine," he said, still quiet. "Do what you need to do." Graham blinked. This was new. Most people begged, cried, shouted, anything to buy themselves more time. But this guy, he just sat there, staring straight ahead like he didn't have a care in the world. Like none of this even mattered. "You got no argument?" Graham asked, suspicious now. "Nope." "Ha!" Graham scratched the stubble on his chin, studying him for a long moment. The longer he stood there, the more he felt that nagging itch of familiarity. It was driving him crazy, the sense that he'd seen this guy before. But where? Well, suit yourself, Graham finally said, shrugging. You've got 48 hours to clear out. If you're not gone, I'll be back with a locksmith and a couple of movers. Understood. Graham frowned at the man's indifference, muttering under his breath as he turned to leave. Weirdo. As he closed the door behind him, he paused in the hallway, that itch still gnawing at the back of his mind. He pulled out his phone, scrolling idly through his messages as if the distraction might clear his head. But even as he walked away, something about the tenant stayed with him. A quiet, nagging suspicion he couldn't shake. Meanwhile, behind the closed door of apartment 2C, the man sat motionless on the couch for a long time, his face hidden beneath the dark fabric of his hoodie. The shadows of the small room stretched out around him, dimming as the sunlight faded outside the window. Finally, he reached up, gripping the edge of the hood with both hands, and pulled it back just far enough for the faintest hint of his features to catch the light. Anyone who had seen that face, really seen it, would have gasped. But for now, the building was quiet, and no one was watching. The door swung open with such force that the frame rattled, echoing down the cracked hallway. Graham Nichols, shoulders squared and jaw set in a permanent scowl, strode through with the air of someone who thought he owned the world, or at least this building. The smell of stale cigarettes clung to his flannel shirt as he surveyed the apartment with a sneer, one hand propped on his hip. In the other, he clutched a manila folder, thicker now than it had been a week ago. It's time, Mr. Graham barked, the kind of voice that didn't invite debate. The tenant, still seated in that same wooden chair by the window, glanced up lazily, as if the entire universe outside that foggy glass pane didn't concern him. A shadow of a smile curled the corners of his lips, like he knew a secret that Graham never would. For a moment, the landlord faltered. Something about the man's calm demeanor felt off. But Graham, of course, wasn't one for overthinking. He plowed ahead. I've been more patient than you deserve. Months, buddy. You've had months to pay what's due. I don't know what kind of scheme you're running here, but my charity's run dry. He waved the folder in the air like a weapon. I've got the paperwork ready to send this all upstairs. You'll be out of here by noon tomorrow. The tenant didn't answer. He turned his head ever so slightly toward the window, his expression placid, unreadable. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars honking, distant sirens wailing. But up here, the tiny apartment seemed untouched by the noise. The muted sun filtered through the grimy glass, catching the sharp lines of the tenant's face. His features were neither handsome nor plain, nothing you'd look at twice on a crowded street. But there was something else about him, something beneath the surface. A strange weight, like an anchor tethering him to secrets Graham couldn't begin to guess. You listening to me? Graham demanded, his voice rising a notch. Still nothing. The landlord's frustration bubbled up like a boiling pot. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, leaning in close to the tenant as though proximity would force him to speak. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, pal, but you're messing with the wrong guy. I'm not here for your little staring contest. Okay? You can play the Zen monk act all you want, but it won't stop what's coming. You'll be out of here tomorrow, and I won't lose a wink of sleep over it. At last, the tenant shifted. Slowly, almost deliberately, he reached for a mug resting on the sill beside him, cradling it in his hand like it was the most precious thing in the room. He took a sip, eyes still distant, then finally spoke. And what makes you so sure, Graham? The words were quiet, calm, but they hit the landlord like a fist to the chest. Graham straightened, narrowing his eyes. Excuse me? The tenant turned to face him fully, and for the first time since Graham had stepped into the apartment, his gaze met the landlord's. There was nothing threatening in his expression, yet somehow, it felt as if Graham had just been pulled under a deep, dark current. You've already decided how this ends, the tenant continued, voice smooth, devoid of emotion. You walk in here, throw your weight around, and assume I'll leave without question. He set the mug down with a soft clink. But tell me something, Graham. What if you don't know as much as you think you do? Graham let out a bark of laughter, though the sound came out harsher than he'd intended. "Oh, I know plenty, buddy. I know you haven't paid me a cent in 3 months. I know the neighbors are sick of seeing you moping around here like you own the place. And I know that your little mystery act isn't going to stop me from calling the sheriff and tossing your things to the curb." The tenant tilted his head, a flicker of amusement dancing across his face. "And yet you're still here." Graham froze for half a second, caught off guard. "What? You could have sent the paperwork yesterday. You could have had the sheriff at my door this morning," the tenant said, steepling his fingers under his chin. "But you didn't. Instead, you came here yourself. To what? Lecture me? Threaten me?" He leaned back in the chair, and suddenly it was Graham who felt small, as though the roles had reversed. "So what is it really, Graham? Are you that desperate for power?" The landlord's cheeks flushed crimson. "Don't get cute with me," he snapped. "You think you're clever? Sitting here like you've got all the answers? You're nothing, pal. A squatter. A deadbeat. Don't pretend you're anything more than that." The tenant's smile widened, though it carried no warmth. "Nothing, you say?" He glanced down at the manila folder Graham still clutched. "I think you'd be surprised." Graham's fingers twitched, the folder crumpling slightly under the pressure. His mind raced, annoyance fighting with an inexplicable unease. "You don't scare me," he growled. "I've seen guys like you before. Think you can play games with people like me? Well, I've got news for you. This is my building, and my word is law here. You're done." The tenant didn't argue. He didn't rise to his feet, didn't shout, didn't throw anything. He simply nodded, slow and deliberate, as though he'd just been handed exactly what he wanted. "Very well," he said softly. "If that's what you believe, Graham." Graham snorted, turning to leave. "Enjoy your last night here, pal. Tomorrow you're gone." But as he stomped out of the apartment, his boots echoing against the scuffed floorboards, the unease gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't reach. The tenant's calm, his words, it didn't sit right. And worse, that smug smile lingered in his mind like a stain. Graham slammed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the hallway. But the moment he stepped into the stale, dusty air outside the unit, he paused. For reasons he couldn't explain, his hands felt clammy. The apartment had been warm, yet his skin prickled with a cold sweat. He shook his head as if to clear it, muttering under his breath. "Just a squatter," he repeated, though the words rang hollow in his ears. And as he walked away, the tenant sat quietly, sipping his coffee, a glimmer of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Graham couldn't shake the feeling as he trudged down the narrow stairs, his boots thudding against the worn wood. The entire building seemed to lean with age, sagging as if exhausted from holding itself up for so many years. The hallway smelled of mildew and old carpet, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped from a leaking pipe. He'd been in this building more times than he could count. He'd stomped through its corridors, banged on doors, argued with tenants, and hauled out more than a few deadbeats over the years. But today it felt different. That man, whoever he was, had unnerved him. The calmness, the smug confidence. It was like being stared at by someone who knew the punchline to a joke you hadn't even realized you were a part of. By the time Graham reached the ground floor, his frustration had curdled into something uglier. He needed to do something. He needed to get control of the situation. "Hey, Mr. Nichols!" Graham flinched at the voice and turned to see Timmy, the building's resident handyman, slouched by the front door. The kid was barely out of his 20s, rail-thin with a mop of unkempt hair that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. He was fiddling with a busted radio, the static hissing faintly as he twisted the dials. "What?" Graham snapped, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Timmy blinked, startled. Sorry. Just wanted to let you know the radiator's busted again in 2B. Mrs. Johnson says it's been freezing all night." Graham waved him off. "Yeah, I'll deal with it later. Got bigger problems right now." Timmy hesitated, shifting his weight. "Is it about the guy in 4C? Graham froze mid-step and turned slowly. "What do you know about 4C? Timmy scratched his head, looking uncomfortable. "Not much, really. He's weird, though. Been here a while, but nobody knows much about him. Doesn't talk to anyone. Doesn't cause trouble either. Just kinda exists. Graham grunted. Well, he's about to exist somewhere else. Deadbeat hasn't paid rent in months. Timmy squinted at him, clearly debating whether to say more. I don't know, man. I mean, it's none of my business, but he hesitated. Something about him freaks me out. Feels like he's watching you when you're not even looking. Graham's lips pressed into a hard line. That's because you're a paranoid kid with too much time on your hands. Get back to work. Timmy shrugged, clearly unbothered. Sure thing, Mr. Nichols. But if you ask me, you should be careful. I've seen guys like him before. The quiet ones. They're the ones you've got to watch out for. Yeah. Thanks for the life advice, Graham muttered, pushing past him and out the front door. The cold air hit him like a slap. Outside, the neighborhood bustled with its usual mid-morning rhythm. Cars growling down the narrow streets, vendors shouting over one another from makeshift stalls, kids in backpacks weaving through the crowds on their way to school. The sun was out, but it gave little warmth, hanging low in a sky that looked washed out and tired. Graham stomped toward his truck, yanking the door open and climbing in with a grunt. The driver's seat creaked under his weight as he tossed the manila folder onto the passenger seat, its contents spilling out slightly. A collection of notices, overdue payment reminders, and a formal eviction warning stared back at him, all stamped with his heavy, blocky signature. He snatched one of the papers and skimmed the tenant's information again. Name Charles E. Miller, age 42. Occupation unknown. There was nothing unusual about the file. No employment records, no history of complaints, no police reports. Just a man who'd moved into the apartment under perfectly normal circumstances and then stopped paying rent, stopped talking to neighbors, stopped being normal. Graham rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. This was supposed to be simple. Get the paperwork filed, let the sheriff handle the dirty work, and move on. He'd done it dozens of times. But this wasn't simple. The guy in 4C wasn't like the others. He didn't beg. He didn't cry or argue. He didn't even get angry. He just sat there, staring through Graham like he already knew how the story ended. Graham slammed his hand on the steering wheel, the horn honking loudly, startling a passerby. What the hell is his deal? He muttered. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him. He fished it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown caller. For a moment, he debated ignoring it. But the buzzing persisted, grating on his nerves. He thumbed the green button and held the phone to his ear. Yeah, silence. Graham's brow furrowed. Hello. More silence. Then faintly, so faintly that he almost missed it, a voice crackled through the line. Leave him alone, Graham. Graham sat up straighter, his grip on the phone tightening. Who is this? The line went dead. For a long moment, Graham sat frozen, the phone still pressed against his ear, the dull hum of static filling the silence. He glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed despite the crowd milling past his truck. He pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. Call ended. His heart was hammering now, though he couldn't explain why. It was probably a prank, one of those scam calls, or maybe some tenant's idea of revenge. Yeah, that's all it was. But the voice lingered in his ears, low and flat, like a whisper in the dark. Leave him alone, Graham. Shaking his head, he tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and threw the truck into gear. He'd wasted enough time. This needed to end. As the engine rumbled to life, Graham muttered under his breath, his voice tight. I don't care who you think you are, Charles Miller. You're out of here tomorrow. But as he drove away, a strange, gnawing dread twisted in his gut, refusing to let go. The truck growled down the road, its engine grinding like a protest against the cold morning air. Graham gripped the wheel tighter than he needed to, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather. He drove without music, without talk radio. Just the hum of the tires on asphalt and the nagging whisper of that voice in his head. Leave him alone, Graham. It was ridiculous. Childish. Who even called like that anymore? Some punk with too much time on their hands trying to get under his skin. But the words stuck there like a splinter, burrowing deep. He grunted and shifted in his seat, trying to shake the thought loose. The phone buzzed on the passenger seat, vibrating against the manila folder. Graham glanced over, lips pressing into a tight line. It was unknown caller again. "Not this time," he muttered, snatching the phone and shoving it face down into the cup holder. The buzzing stopped after a moment, but somehow, the silence it left behind was worse. He didn't realize he'd driven straight to the courthouse until he was already pulling into the cracked parking lot. It was muscle memory, years of evicting tenants, filing notices, dealing with paperwork. He parked and climbed out, boots crunching over scattered gravel. The courthouse stood in front of him, squat and gray like a monument to bureaucracy. Inside, it smelled of dust and old carpet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a sickly yellow hue. Graham made his way to the clerk's office, ignoring the murmurs and faint laughter from other people waiting their turn. He didn't have time for small talk today. The clerk, a woman in her mid-50s with thick glasses perched on her nose, looked up as he approached the counter. "Back again, Mr. Nichols?" she asked dryly, as though evictions were his only hobby. "Morning, Gladys," Graham grumbled, slapping the manila folder onto the counter. "Need this filed today. Tenant in 4C. Overdue rent, ignoring notices." Same drill as always. Gladys took the folder, opening it and skimming through the pages. She adjusted her glasses, peering closer at the name. "Charles Miller? That name sounds familiar." Graham raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She shook her head, flipping the papers back into place. "Oh, nothing. It's probably nothing. Just one of those names, you know? Feels like you've heard it before. Happens all the time in this job." "Yeah, well, you probably haven't heard it in the last 3 months. The guy's been sitting up there like he owns the place, staring out that window. I'm done with him." Gladys gave him a sharp look. "You don't like him, do you?" "Like him? He's a deadbeat, Gladys. What's to like?" She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached for the stamp, pressing it down on the eviction paperwork with a dull thunk. "There you go. It's official now. You'll need to coordinate with the sheriff's office for tomorrow." "Thanks." Graham snatched the folder and turned to leave, but Gladys's voice stopped him mid-step. "Be careful, Graham." He turned back, frowning. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged, a strange look crossing her face. "Nothing. Just, not everyone you evict goes quietly." Graham scoffed. "Yeah, well, they don't have a choice." But her words followed him out of the courthouse like a shadow. By the time Graham returned to the building, the sun had climbed high, casting harsh light over the peeling paint and grime-streaked windows. It was a crumbling relic of a neighborhood, and he'd spent enough years trying to keep it standing that he knew every crack in the walls. But as he stood in the narrow hallway outside for C, that familiar confidence wavered. He stared at the door, hand frozen just above the wood. It was quiet inside. Too quiet. Graham cleared his throat, knocking harder than he needed to. "Miller, you hear me in there?" No response. He knocked again. "Last warning, pal. You've got less than 24 hours left. If you don't start packing, I'll have the sheriff here to haul you out." Still nothing. Graham's patience snapped. He jiggled the doorknob, locked, of course, and pressed his ear to the wood. For a moment, he thought he heard something faint. A hum, maybe like machinery running in the background. He frowned. "What the hell are you doing in there?" His hand drifted toward the ring of keys on his belt. He hesitated. Technically, he wasn't supposed to let himself into an occupied unit without notice. But something about the silence, the tension behind that door, it was gnawing at him. With a huff, Graham pulled out the master key and shoved it into the lock. The knob turned easily, and the door creaked open. The apartment was dim, the only light spilling in through the window where the tenant always sat. But the chair by the window was empty. The mug was still there, resting on the sill, and the faint hum he'd heard earlier now filled the room. It wasn't machinery, more like an electronic buzz, almost musical, but strange and low-pitched. Graham stepped inside, boots heavy against the scuffed floor. "Miller?" The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, making his skin prickle. It wasn't coming from the window. It wasn't even coming from the walls. Graham's eyes darted toward the corner of the room, where a small, battered suitcase sat open. Wires spilled from the inside, leading to a sleek, black device he didn't recognize. The hum pulsed from the thing, rhythmic and deliberate, like it was waiting for something. "What the?" Graham muttered, inching closer. Before he could reach it, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Graham whipped around, heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" Silence. The hum droned louder now, filling his ears, rattling in his bones. Graham turned back to the suitcase, sweat beading on his forehead. The device blinked once, a tiny red light flaring like an eye, and then it stopped. The hum vanished, plunging the room into an even heavier silence. And then, from behind him, a voice spoke, low, calm, and far too close. "I told you not to come in here, Graham." The voice was soft, almost conversational, but it hit Graham like a slap. He spun around so fast his shoulder knocked into the table, sending the mug on the sill crashing to the floor. It shattered into jagged white shards, but he didn't look at it. His eyes were fixed on the man now standing in the doorway, Charles Miller. The tenant's face was calm, betraying none of the tension Graham felt boiling in his chest. He leaned against the doorframe with the kind of deliberate ease that didn't come naturally. It felt rehearsed, intentional. He wasn't a man caught off guard. If anything, it was as though he had expected Graham to be here, poking around his things. "You let yourself in," Miller said simply, his eyes cold but polite. Graham straightened, masking the pounding of his heart with a hard glare. "This is my building. I don't need permission to check on my property." "Your property," Miller echoed quietly, as though testing the words. "Interesting." The silence that followed was suffocating. Miller stepped forward, and for the first time, Graham noticed something strange. There wasn't a single sound coming from the hallway. No creaking pipes, no footsteps, no voices. It was as if the world outside had fallen away, leaving only this room and the two of them inside it. Graham shoved his hand into his jacket pocket, where he kept his phone. His fingers found it, cold and slick with sweat. "You think you can intimidate me?" he growled, more to himself than Miller. "You don't scare me, you know that? I don't know what you're doing in here, but this ends tomorrow. You're out of my building. End of story." Miller tilted his head slightly, watching Graham with an unsettling patience, like a scientist observing a test subject. "You're a man who prides himself on control, aren't you, Graham? Every tenant, every hallway, every broken pipe. You hold it all in the palm of your hand." He gestured faintly at the room. "And yet here you are, rattled. Why is that?" Graham barked out a humorless laugh, though it came out shaky. "You're delusional. You're the one with nowhere to go. You think you're smart playing mind games? Let me tell you something, pal. You're not the first freeloader I've dealt with. You're just another name on a list." "Am I?" Miller's voice softened, so calm it was unnerving. He took another step forward, and instinctively, Graham mirrored it by taking one back. His boot crunched over the broken mug, but he didn't look away. There was no aggression in Miller's movements, no wild anger, no sudden threats. Somehow that made it worse. The man was in complete control, not just of his body, but of the space around him. Graham felt it now, heavy in the air. The temperature seemed to drop, a chill running through the room that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "What are you even doing in here?" Graham snapped suddenly, desperate to break the silence. He gestured toward the suitcase in the corner, wires still spilling from it like black veins. "What's all this? Huh? What kind of scam are you running?" Miller didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone. Not a new one, but an old flip phone, something that hadn't been in style for years. He held it out in his palm, as though offering it to Graham. The landlord frowned. "What is this?" "It's for you," Miller replied simply. Graham stared at the phone, its tiny screen dark and lifeless. "I'm not touching that. What kind of trick are you trying to pull now?" Miller smiled faintly, though it wasn't a kind smile. "No trick, Graham. Just an offer. You pick it up and you'll get answers. Or, he let the sentence hang in the air, turning his wrist slightly to angle the phone toward Graham. You can walk out now and keep believing you're the one in charge. It's up to you. Graham's pulse thundered in his ears. The room felt smaller somehow, as though the walls were inching closer. He didn't move, couldn't. His eyes darted between Miller and the phone, his instinct screaming at him to walk out, call the sheriff, get this man out of his life. But something about the tenant's voice, the calm certainty of it, made him hesitate. "What's the game, Miller?" he demanded. "You think I'm gonna fall for some cheap setup? Is this blackmail?" "No game," Miller said softly, still holding the phone steady. "Just answers." Graham clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the sweat pooling in the hollow of his back. He was tired of being cornered, of being made to feel like he was the one out of place here. Without thinking, he lunged forward and snatched the phone from Miller's hand, gripping it tightly. "Fine. You want me to play along? Let's see what you've got," he spat. Miller didn't react. He merely stepped back, folding his hands behind his back like he was watching a performance. "Go ahead, Graham. Open it." Graham hesitated, the weight of the flip phone unnatural in his palm. It was absurd. Why was he letting this guy get under his skin? He flicked it open with his thumb, expecting nothing. No power, no message, no signal. Instead, the screen blinked to life. There were no menus, no numbers, just a single text message glowing in blocky white letters across the dark background. "You're not who you think you are." Graham's brow furrowed, confusion tangling with his rising anger. He glanced up at Miller, whose face betrayed nothing. "What is this supposed to mean?" Graham growled, shaking the phone as if to force a better answer out of it. "What kind of sick?" Before he could finish, the phone buzzed violently in his hand. A second message appeared beneath the first, and this time it felt like a punch to the gut. "Ask him who he really is." Graham's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at Miller, who was still standing there, silent and motionless. The question, unspoken but heavy, hung in the air. Who was this man? Miller tilted his head ever so slightly, as if reading Graham's thoughts. Then, with that same faint smile, he murmured, "I told you. You don't know as much as you think." Graham stumbled back, the phone slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. For the first time in years, he felt small, like a child who had wandered somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. And Miller, standing there as calm as ever, didn't move to follow him. Graham's back hit the doorframe as he staggered into the hallway, his breathing heavy and uneven. He wiped his palm against his jeans, realizing with disgust how clammy it had gotten. The phone lay where it had fallen, its small screen still glowing faintly. Miller hadn't moved. He stood there, still as stone, watching Graham's every flinch with that quiet, knowing expression. It wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Graham fumbled for the doorknob, his fingers scraping against the wood as he backed into the hallway. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but it ends now. You hear me?" he snapped, his voice wavering slightly. "Tomorrow morning, first thing, you're out of here. You'll have the sheriff on your doorstep." Charles Miller didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence did all the talking. Graham turned sharply, leaving the door swinging half shut behind him as he stormed down the hallway. He didn't look back. He didn't want to look back. It felt like if he did, he'd see something he wasn't ready to see. The air felt colder out here, the hallway stretching out longer than it should have. Every footstep echoed back at him, hollow and wrong. Graham didn't realize how fast he was walking until he reached the staircase, practically throwing himself down the first few steps. His boots clattered against the worn wood as he muttered under his breath. "This is crazy. I'm losing my mind. No, he's playing tricks. He's trying to scare me, that's all." He pushed through the front door and stumbled into the daylight, where the sun felt too bright, too sharp. Outside, life carried on as usual, cars rumbling past, pigeons squabbling on the sidewalk, the distant hum of the city. But Graham felt like he'd walked out of a different world entirely, one that didn't belong to him anymore. He leaned against the hood of his truck, pulling in deep, shaky breaths as he tried to steady himself. It was fine. It was just some squatter screwing with him. A deadbeat who didn't want to leave quietly. That's all. Graham turned his head slightly and caught sight of Timmy, the scrawny handyman, leaning against the building with a cigarette dangling between his fingers. He was staring up at one of the windows, Miller's window. Graham frowned, pushing himself upright. Timmy! Timmy startled, dropping the cigarette and stomping it out quickly. Hey, Mr. Nichols. Didn't see you there. Graham crossed the short distance between them, his boots grinding against the gravel. What are you doing out here? Timmy shoved his hands into his pockets, shoulders slumping defensively. Nothing. Just checking something. Checking what? Timmy glanced up at the window again and then back at Graham. It's weird, you know? I was walking by, and I could have sworn I saw him up there, just staring, but not out the window at me, like he knew I was gonna look. Graham felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean, staring? He's still up there. Timmy shook his head slowly. Nah, I mean maybe, I don't know. It's like sometimes he's there and sometimes he's not. He swallowed hard, as though embarrassed to say it out loud. It sounds dumb, I know, but I swear. Sometimes it feels like he's everywhere. Get a hold of yourself, Graham snapped, though the words came out harsher than he'd meant. You're just letting him get into your head. Timmy kicked at a rock near his foot, staring down at the ground. Maybe, but you should be careful, Mr. Nichols. I'm telling you, there's something off about that guy. I don't think he's who he says he is. Graham scowled, shoving past him. Nobody's who they say they are, kid. That's life. He climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut behind him. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his hands started to ache. He needed answers. Real answers. This game, this smug arrogance Miller had, it had to stop. The manila folder still sat on the passenger seat where he'd tossed it earlier. Graham grabbed it and flipped it open, scanning through the tenant's sparse records again. Something was missing. Something didn't add up. He pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office, pressing the device hard to his ear. The voice on the other end answered after 2 rings. Sheriff's office. Yeah, it's Graham Nichols, he said quickly, trying to sound like his usual self. I need to confirm the eviction for tomorrow morning. The guy in 4C, Charles Miller. The line was quiet for a moment, save for the faint rustling of papers in the background. Then the voice returned, calm but cautious. Graham, there's no scheduled eviction for tomorrow. We haven't received anything from you. Graham froze. What? No, He glanced down at the folder, flipping through its contents. The paperwork he'd just filed earlier was gone. The documents, the eviction notices, everything. No, I was there this morning. I had Gladys stamp it herself. I don't know what to tell you, the voice replied. If you filed something, we don't have it. You'll need to bring in a new set of documents. Otherwise, we can't process it. Graham's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the rest of the call. He ended it without another word, staring down at the empty folder in his lap. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He could see Gladys's tired expression, could hear the thunk of the stamp. How could the paperwork just vanish? Something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. Movement. Graham turned his head, looking out the truck's back window. Up on the 4th floor, in the window of 4C, a shadow stood perfectly still. It wasn't clear. It was just a silhouette, dark against the pale afternoon light. But Graham knew who it was. Charles Miller. Watching him, Graham's skin crawled. He turned the key in the ignition, the truck rumbling back to life. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just had to get away from that building. From him. As he pulled away from the curb, he risked one last glance in the mirror. The shadow in the window was gone. Graham drove with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes fixed on the road while his mind raced in 100 directions. The truck's engine roared louder than usual, but he didn't care. The world outside blurred past. Rows of buildings, faded storefronts, pedestrians shuffling along sidewalks. None of it mattered right now. His mind was still back in that room, staring at the glowing phone screen, at the smug calm in Miller's face. The paperwork was gone. Gone. He had filed it. He knew he had filed it. Gladys had stamped it herself, the memory fresh in his mind, the thunk of the rubber on the paper still ringing in his ears. And yet, there he sat in his truck, holding an empty manila folder that mocked him with its crisp, blank insides. It was as though the eviction itself had been erased, leaving only doubt in its place. Who was Miller? What kind of man could play these games, twist reality like this? Graham's hand shot toward the radio, twisting the dial roughly, needing something, anything, to distract him. Static buzzed at first, filling the truck with harsh white noise before a faint voice broke through. No official comment yet from the company or its CEO. Graham stopped, frowning as the voice sharpened, clearer now. Despite rumors swirling over his sudden disappearance, speculation continues about the billionaire's next move. While his team remains tight-lipped, sources close to the matter suggest the disappearance is deliberate, raising further questions about his intentions and his connection to ongoing ventures. The voice faded as static overtook the broadcast again. Graham blinked, his hand slipping from the radio dial. A billionaire? Missing? He shook his head, muttering to himself. What does that have to do with anything? I'm losing it. A honk jarred him back into reality. A green light had turned yellow, and a car behind him blared impatiently. Graham hit the gas, the truck jolting forward through the intersection, his heart still hammering in his chest. When he reached his house, a squat, weather-beaten place tucked at the edge of the neighborhood, he parked crookedly in the driveway, barely bothering to cut the engine before climbing out. The manila folder sat crumpled in the passenger seat, but he left it there. He didn't want to look at it anymore. Inside, the house felt quieter than usual, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only sound. Graham tossed his keys onto the table and scrubbed his hands down his face, pacing the living room like a caged animal. He stopped abruptly by the window, his eyes narrowing at his own reflection in the glass. The man staring back at him looked older than he remembered. Lines etched deeper into his forehead, dark circles beneath his eyes. When had that happened? He turned away, muttering, "Get a grip, Graham. It's just some guy. You're letting him get into your head." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. His phone buzzed, the sharp vibration rattling against the kitchen counter. Graham froze. The sound made his skin prickle. He walked toward it slowly, as though approaching something dangerous. When he picked it up, the screen flashed the words he'd been dreading. Unknown caller. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the red button. This time, he let it ring. The buzzing went on and on, filling the room, until it finally stopped. Silence. Graham exhaled a shaky breath, and then the phone buzzed again. This time, a text. He didn't want to look, but his body moved on instinct. The message sat on the screen in blocky white letters. "We told you to leave him alone." Graham dropped the phone as though it had burned him, the clatter echoing through the house. No, no, he muttered, backing away, hands trembling. He felt like a cornered animal, every exit closing in around him. Who were we? And why did the voice keep warning him about Charles Miller? The ringing in his ears grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat. Desperation clawed at him as he grabbed the phone off the floor and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb stopping on one name, Gladys. She'd seen him file the paperwork. She'd talked to him this morning. She had to know something. He hit call and paced as it rang, the seconds stretching endlessly. Finally, the line clicked, and Gladys's familiar voice answered, though it sounded tired. "Hello, Gladys," Graham barked, his voice sharp with panic. "It's Graham. Listen, I need you to check something for me. The paperwork I brought in this morning, the eviction notice for 4C. What happened to it?" There was a pause on the other end. "Graham, what are you talking about?" "The paperwork," he nearly shouted. "Charles Miller, the tenant in 4C. I filed it this morning." "You stamped it yourself." Gladys's voice came back, slower this time, edged with something that made Graham's blood run cold. "Graham, there's no tenant in 4C. His throat went dry. What do you mean there's no tenant? He's been there for months. You've seen him? No, I haven't, Gladys interrupted softly. And you haven't filed anything for 4C. Graham, that unit's been empty for over a year. Graham stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table for support as the room tilted around him. No, you're wrong. I was just in there. He was right in front of me. I don't know what's going on, but I think you need to get some rest, Gladys said gently. Maybe you're getting your units mixed up. There's no one in 4C. There hasn't been for a long time. The line clicked dead before Graham could respond, the dial tone humming faintly in his ear. He stood there, motionless, as the phone slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. His mind refused to make sense of it, the pieces clashing together like broken glass. No tenant in 4C, empty for over a year. And yet, Graham had seen him, spoken to him, felt the weight of his stare. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the windows. Graham turned slowly, his eyes drifting to the manila folder still crumpled in the passenger seat of his truck. Then he looked at his front door. It was open. The air in the house shifted, the quiet suddenly heavier. And from somewhere behind him, a voice, familiar and calm, spoke softly. You're starting to see now, aren't you, Graham? Graham froze, his blood running cold as the voice drifted through the heavy stillness of the house. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. It was as though his body had forgotten how to move, his legs locking beneath him, his chest squeezing so tight he could barely draw breath. You're starting to see now, aren't you, Graham? It was Miller. That voice, smooth, calm, maddeningly certain, spoke to him like it always did, quiet and deliberate, as if Miller already knew what Graham was going to do next. Graham's hands clenched the edge of the table hard enough to make his knuckles ache. He swallowed, his throat dry. Get out, he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was no response. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. The silence clawed at him like a living thing, stretching longer and longer until it felt unbearable. Get out! He screamed suddenly, spinning around, his pulse thundering in his ears. The room was empty. The open front door swung slightly on its hinges, a faint creak breaking the silence. The setting sun poured through it, bathing the doorway in a cold, orange glow that stretched long shadows across the floor. There was no one there. Graham's chest heaved as he scanned the room, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. It felt like he was being watched, like Miller's gaze was pressed against him even now. He staggered to the front door, slamming it shut so hard the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. He turned the deadbolt, locking it with a sharp click. His breathing slowed, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He pressed his palms flat against the wood, his forehead resting against the door. This isn't happening, he muttered to himself, his voice ragged. This isn't real. He's messing with me. He's just a squatter. Just some psycho trying to get in my head. But the words felt empty even as he said them. Graham turned, looking back at his living room. It felt wrong now, like the space had been invaded, though nothing appeared out of place. His phone lay where it had fallen, face down on the floor, but he didn't dare touch it. Instead, his eyes landed on the manila folder still sitting in the passenger seat of his truck, visible through the window. He needed to see it again. He needed something real, something tangible to hold on to. Graham grabbed his keys off the table and yanked open the front door, storming outside as though sheer force would keep the fear at bay. The gravel crunched under his boots as he reached the truck and flung open the door. The manila folder sat where he'd left it, crumpled and empty. But now something else sat beside it. A single sheet of paper. Graham's breath caught in his throat. He didn't remember putting it there. He reached out with shaking hands, his fingertips brushing the paper's edge as though it might burn him. Finally, he picked it up. It wasn't a bill or eviction notice. It wasn't his handwriting. It was a printed document, old and faded, the words typed in neat, formal letters. At the top, in bold, Charles E. Miller, Project File 12. Graham frowned, his pulse pounding in his ears as he scanned the paper. It was a file, something official, though he couldn't understand half of it. There were terms he didn't recognize: prototype simulation, cognitive divergence, alpha phase 1. Near the bottom, one line of text stood out, sharper than all the rest. Status: terminated. Graham's heart skipped a beat. His eyes flew over the paper again, as though he'd missed something. Terminated? The word hit him like a punch to the gut, making his head spin. What the hell is this? He muttered, his voice shaking. He looked up instinctively, his eyes drawn back to the fourth-floor window of the building he owned. There, in 4C, the curtain shifted slightly. It wasn't much, just a flicker of movement like someone pulling back the fabric to watch him. But it was enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The paper trembled in his hands as his mind raced. Project file? Terminated? None of it made sense. It wasn't just some trick, wasn't just a prank. This, whatever this was, ran deeper. He needed answers. Real answers. Graham shoved the paper back into the folder, climbed into the truck, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life beneath him, louder than he remembered. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and stared up at the building again. He wasn't afraid of squatters. He wasn't afraid of tricks. But for the first time, staring up at that window, he realized he might be afraid of Charles Miller. Graham put the truck into gear and pulled away, his tires kicking up gravel. He didn't know where he was going yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to the house, and he couldn't stay here. Not until he figured out who or what he was dealing with. As the truck rumbled down the empty street, his phone buzzed again on the seat beside him. Graham hesitated, glancing at it. The screen lit up, and this time the message wasn't anonymous. It was a name: Charles Miller. Graham's throat tightened as he reached for the phone with shaking fingers. He hesitated for one long moment, then swiped the screen open. There was a single message. "You can't run, Graham. I'm everywhere." The truck jerked suddenly as Graham swerved, his heart slamming in his chest. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor of the cab, but the words were already seared into his mind. He gripped the wheel tighter, forcing himself to keep driving, though the voice echoed through his head again and again, louder and louder until it was all he could hear. "I'm everywhere." The sound of the truck's tires grinding against asphalt was the only thing grounding Graham as he drove aimlessly, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his hands started to cramp. The streetlights blurred into faint streaks of yellow as the sun dipped below the skyline, surrendering the city to the deep gray of twilight. His breath came in shallow bursts, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the words from flashing in his mind. "I'm everywhere." He reached for the phone on the floor of the passenger seat, his fingers fumbling over the screen as if expecting to find answers there. But it sat dark and silent now, as though mocking him. The message was still there, lingering on the screen in harsh, glowing text. "You can't run, Graham. I'm everywhere." He tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles ached, then hurled it onto the seat beside him, where it landed with a dull thud. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be. He was Graham Nichols, landlord, businessman, the guy people hated because he got things done. No one intimidated him. No one. And yet, the way Charles Miller had looked at him back in that apartment, calm, certain, in control, still sent chills crawling up his spine. Then there was the file in his truck, the words "status." Terminated, stamped like a warning. It was official, real, something that had no business in his life. Graham didn't know what kind of man could make documents vanish, leave cryptic messages, or manipulate people to the point of madness, but he intended to find out. The truck's headlights sliced through the darkness as he pulled into an old diner parking lot on the edge of town. It was a place Graham had driven past 100 times but never stepped foot inside. The neon sign buzzing above the roof read "Jack's Place," though the letters flickered, as though deciding whether to stay lit or give up entirely. He shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the diner's fogged-up windows. A few people sat inside, hunched over plates of food, but Graham didn't care about them. He wasn't here to eat. He was here because he couldn't go home, not yet, and he couldn't stay parked on the side of the road like some lost fool. He grabbed the manila folder and climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching over loose gravel as he made his way to the entrance. The bell above the door jingled faintly as he stepped inside, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon washing over him. The lights buzzed, the booths were cracked, and the waitress behind the counter barely glanced up as she wiped her hands on a stained apron. "Sit anywhere," she called in a monotone, her voice hoarse from years of smoking. Graham settled into a booth at the far end of the diner, his back to the wall. He needed space. He needed to think. The manila folder sat in front of him on the chipped tabletop, the file's edges slightly curled. He opened it again, staring down at the faded document that shouldn't exist. Charles E. Miller, Project File 12. The words cognitive divergence and alpha phase 1 meant nothing to him. It read like something out of a science fiction novel, something he had no business even touching. But that one line, the one that said status, terminated, hung heavy in his mind. The waitress appeared at the edge of his table, startling him. "Coffee!" Graham looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Yeah, black." She nodded and shuffled off. Graham looked back down at the file, his mind racing. Who was Miller? A con man? A hacker? Some lunatic with access to things he shouldn't have? The name tickled something at the back of his mind, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place it. Charles E. Miller, he muttered, the name feeling heavier every time he said it. The waitress returned, sliding a chipped mug of coffee in front of him. Graham didn't acknowledge her, didn't even glance up. He reached for the file again, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped the page. There, scrawled at the bottom in faded ink, was something new, something he hadn't noticed before. Contact. E.M. Graham blinked, frowning as he traced the letters with his fingertip. M, he whispered, the initials reverberating in his mind. Then it hit him like a freight train crashing through the walls of his sanity. His head shot up, his pulse hammering so hard it felt like his veins might burst. No, he muttered, the pieces clicking into place faster than he could process them. He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing sharp and shallow. It can't be Elon Musk. The name roared through his mind like a storm, unraveling everything he thought he knew. Charles Miller, CM, had been a placeholder, a disguise, a name scribbled on a lease that meant nothing. It was a cover for someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who didn't belong in Graham's crumbling old building, sitting silently in the shadows, waiting. Elon Musk, the most recognizable name on the planet. A man who could buy the entire block Graham owned and not even notice the dent in his bank account. A man who had disappeared from the public eye without warning, just like the news report had said. Graham felt his world tilt sideways, his grip tightening on the file as though it might vanish before his eyes. It didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. Why would a billionaire be sitting in a rundown apartment, staring out a window, playing games with a landlord like him? The bell above the diner door jingled again. Graham looked up instinctively, and his stomach dropped. Charles Miller was standing in the doorway. He didn't belong there. Not in this place, not in this dim, forgotten diner. But he was there all the same, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the parking lot lights. Miller's gaze swept the room slowly, methodically, until it landed on Graham. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Graham saw something flicker in Miller's expression, something that looked a lot like satisfaction. Graham's mouth went dry as Miller began walking toward him, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the low murmur of conversation falling silent. It was as though every eye in the room turned to watch, though no one moved or spoke. Miller stopped at the edge of Graham's booth, his face cast in shadow. "You understand now," he said quietly. Graham couldn't speak. He couldn't even breathe. Miller set something down on the table. Graham didn't look at it at first. His eyes were locked on the man standing before him, the impossible truth staring back at him. Finally, he looked down. It was a business card. Plain, white, unmarked except for 3 words printed in bold black letters. Tesla Corporation. E. Musk. The card sat there on the table, innocuous in its simplicity, but Graham couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The black letters seemed to burn into his mind. Tesla Corporation. Musk. His breath came in shallow gasps, the walls of the diner pressing in on him, the hum of the buzzing lights overhead turning into a low, grinding roar in his ears. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening, and yet, Charles Miller, Elon Musk, stood right there, unmoving, calm as ever. There was no mask, no disguise, no trick. Only the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing to hide anymore. "Sit down," Graham croaked, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Miller tilted his head slightly, considering the invitation, then slid into the booth across from him with deliberate ease. For a man whose name could stop conversations in boardrooms across the globe, there was no arrogance in his movements. He sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, his expression measured, almost patient, as if waiting for Graham to catch up. Graham stared at him, throat tight. "You," the word caught in his mouth like a splinter. "You're..." "Say it," Miller murmured, his voice low but clear. Graham leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. "Why are you here? Why? Why?" Miller interrupted softly, his tone carrying no malice, only curiosity. "Isn't that the question you've been asking since the moment you first saw me?" Graham's mouth snapped shut. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to shake the man until the pieces made sense. But Miller's calm stare held him like a vice. The quiet confidence that surrounded him made Graham feel small, insignificant. "You've been looking for control," Miller continued, his gaze steady. "Haven't you, Graham? Your building, your tenants, your rules, everything in its place. And yet here I am. Something you can't explain, something you can't push out or bully into submission. I unsettle you because I don't fit in your world." Graham's fingers curled against the table. "You don't belong here," he spat. "You don't belong in that apartment, in my building. Why are you there?" Miller leaned back slightly, as though amused by the question. "What makes it yours?" "It is mine," Graham snapped, his voice rising, raw with anger and panic. "I own it. You own the walls," Miller cut him off, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You own the floors, the pipes, the locks. But you don't own what happens inside, do you? You don't own the space people create when they call a place home." "That's crap," Graham growled, though the words felt empty. His pulse was thundering now, his throat tight with something between rage and fear. "You think you can play games with me? You're some big-shot billionaire who thinks he can screw with people like me? That's what this is, isn't it? Some kind of joke? What, you get bored running your companies and decided to slum it in my building?" Miller didn't blink, didn't flinch. He watched Graham unravel with the same unshakable calm, as though the scene were playing out exactly as he'd expected. "Do you think I'm here by accident, Graham?" Graham's head spun. He was losing control of his words, of the room, of the entire situation. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but it ends now. I'll call the sheriff. Miller tilted his head again, the faintest shadow of a smile flickering across his lips. "Go ahead." Graham froze. "Call the sheriff," Miller continued, his voice steady. "File another eviction notice. Bring your paperwork and your rules. I won't stop you." The air in the diner seemed to thicken. Graham stared at the man across from him, his brain screaming at him to act, to do something, but he couldn't. The weight of Miller's words sat on him like stone, suffocating and heavy. "You don't get it, do you?" Miller said softly. "You've been running this little corner of the world for so long that you think you're untouchable, that you can throw your weight around and no one will push back." He paused, his voice sharpening. "But some people push back, Graham." Graham's hands began to tremble. "You're threatening me now?" "No," Miller said simply. "I'm warning you. There's a difference." Graham shoved back from the table, so suddenly the coffee mug toppled, spilling black liquid across the surface. The sharp scrape of his boots against the linoleum echoed through the diner, but Graham barely heard it. "Stay the hell away from me," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward Miller. "Stay out of my building. Stay out of my life." Miller didn't rise. He sat there, watching as Graham stumbled toward the door, his chest heaving with every breath. Just as Graham reached the threshold, the voice came again, low and calm. "Running won't change what you've done, Graham." The words froze him in place. He turned slowly, his heart hammering. Miller was still seated in the booth, the faint reflection of neon light flickering across his face. "What I've done?" Graham's voice cracked, his throat dry. "What are you talking about?" Miller didn't answer. He didn't need to. Graham turned and fled into the night. Outside, the parking lot felt too big, too empty. The truck sat where he'd left it. But as he yanked the door open, the silence of the world pressed in on him. The headlights flickered to life as he turned the key, flooding the pavement with pale yellow light. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing in 1,000 different directions. "What I've done." The words clawed at him, digging up things he didn't want to remember. Things he'd buried so deep he thought they'd never see the light of day again. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Tall, motionless, a shadow against the darkened trees. Graham squinted, his breath catching in his throat. It was Miller. No, it couldn't be. He'd just left him inside the diner. Graham slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as the tires squealed against the pavement. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The road stretched out ahead of him, empty and endless, but the figure burned itself into his mind. Miller's words echoed with every mile, growing louder, sharper, until they were all he could hear. "Running won't change what you've done." The truck's headlights pierced through the dark, the beams sweeping over empty roads and barren stretches of land as Graham sped blindly into the night. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. Away from the diner, away from the man who shouldn't have been there, away from the voice that wouldn't stop echoing in his head. "Running won't change what you've done." Graham gritted his teeth, his hands locked on the wheel as the truck rattled over uneven pavement. His breathing came hard and fast, the sound filling the cab like a second heartbeat. He glanced in the rearview mirror for the 10th time, half expecting to see Miller's face staring back at him from the darkness. But the road behind him was empty, nothing but shadows and faint pinpricks of light in the distance. "Stop it," Graham muttered under his breath, shaking his head violently as if the motion could dislodge the voice. "This is in your head. This is some trick. He's screwing with you." The words felt hollow even as he said them. The truck crested a small hill, and Graham spotted an old gas station ahead, its lone fluorescent light flickering above the pumps. He slowed as he approached, his truck sputtering slightly as the gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. Pulling up to the pump, Graham killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring out the windshield. The gas station was deserted, the small building sitting dark and lifeless. The neon open sign in the window buzzed faintly, though no one was inside. Graham stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the cracked pavement with a thud, the cold night air stinging his skin. The silence felt heavy out here, stretched too thin, like the world was holding its breath. He grabbed the nozzle and shoved it into the tank, his eyes flicking toward the empty road. The faint hum of the pump filled the air, the sound somehow deafening in the stillness. Graham rubbed his free hand across his face, trying to clear the fog in his head. He kept seeing Miller, standing in the diner, standing in the parking lot, standing everywhere Graham looked. But it wasn't just his face. It was the words that wouldn't stop repeating, over and over. "Running won't change what you've done." Graham let out a shaky breath, his hand clenching the gas pump so tightly it creaked. He knew what those words were pointing at, even if he didn't want to admit it. There were things he'd buried, actions he'd locked away, convinced himself they didn't matter. Deals made, corners cut, people ruined. But they did matter. They mattered now. The pump clicked off suddenly, and Graham jolted, startled by the sound. He pulled the nozzle free and slammed it back onto the holder, then turned sharply to climb into the truck. That's when he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the gas station lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Graham's heart stopped cold. He couldn't see the face. It was just a silhouette, tall and still, like a statue carved out of shadow. But he knew who it was. Miller. No, Graham whispered, backing toward the truck door. You're not here. You can't be here. The figure didn't move. Graham wrenched the door open and climbed in, slamming it shut behind him. His hands fumbled for the keys, shaking so hard he nearly dropped them. Finally, the engine roared to life, and he threw the truck into gear, tires squealing as he tore out of the gas station. The road stretched out ahead of him again, empty and endless. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his knuckles white against the wheel. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He couldn't. The road blurred as the truck sped faster, the engine groaning in protest. The trees on either side of the highway flashed past like black smudges against the night sky. But no matter how far Graham drove, the feeling wouldn't go away. He wasn't alone. Graham's breathing grew ragged as his mind screamed at him to stop, to pull over, to find help. But who could he turn to? He couldn't explain any of this. The vanished paperwork, the messages, the file in his truck, the man who seemed to be everywhere at once. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The phone buzzed on the seat beside him, vibrating against the cracked leather. Graham flinched, his eyes darting to the glowing screen. Unknown caller. He let it buzz. He let it stop. And then, just as before, a text appeared. You can't outrun this, Graham. Graham's throat tightened. His hand shot out to grab the phone, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He stared at the message, the letters glowing faintly in the dark cab, and for a moment, the fear twisted into anger. Hot and sudden, a spark of the old Graham flaring back to life. Why, he snarled, slamming his hand against the wheel. What do you want from me? The phone buzzed again. Another message appeared. It's time to face what you've done. The words sat there, heavy and cold, like a sentence passed down from on high. Graham's breathing hitched. His eyes flicked up to the road, and suddenly, headlights, a pair of blinding white beams appeared out of nowhere, barreling toward him at breakneck speed. Graham's heart leapt into his throat as he yanked the wheel to the side, the truck screeching across the asphalt as the headlights roared past, the blare of a horn deafening in his ears. The truck lurched onto the shoulder, tires skidding on loose gravel before it slammed to a stop. Graham sat frozen, his hands still clutching the wheel, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His chest ached, his head pounding with the force of his pulse. Slowly, he turned to look back at the road. The headlights were gone. The road was empty. The truck sat in complete darkness now, the engine idling quietly, as though nothing had happened. Graham swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He wiped a shaking hand across his face, trying to catch his breath. But when he looked back down at the phone still glowing in his lap, his blood went cold. A final message had appeared. It's time, Graham. Go back. Graham stared at the screen, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped the phone. Go back? To the building? To Miller? No, he muttered, shaking his head as panic clawed at his chest. No, no, no. I'm not going back. I'm not. But as he looked up, his heart stopped. Standing on the side of the road, illuminated faintly by the truck's headlights, was a figure. Tall, still, impossible. Miller. Graham slammed his foot on the gas, the tires squealing as the truck shot forward, roaring back onto the road. The figure disappeared into the night behind him, but Graham didn't look back. Miller's words echoed louder than ever, crawling through his mind like a sickness. It's time to face what you've done. The truck tore down the darkened road, its engine groaning in protest as Graham pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The speedometer crept past 80, then 90, the numbers climbing as though the faster he drove, the further he could escape. His knuckles were white against the wheel, his breath sharp and uneven as his mind replayed the message. It's time, Graham. Go back. The words echoed in his head, loud and inescapable, like a voice whispering directly into his ear. He blinked hard, forcing himself to focus on the road, but the image of Miller, standing there on the shoulder as if he'd been waiting, was seared into his vision. This isn't real, Graham muttered to himself, his voice shaky, raw. "It's not real. He's not real." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Miller was real. He was everywhere Graham turned, at the apartment, at the diner, at the gas station, on the road. And worse than that, he knew. He knew something Graham had buried. The tires skidded suddenly as Graham swerved onto the side road leading back toward the building. He wasn't making the choice consciously anymore. His hands moved on their own, the truck following a path he couldn't turn away from. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as he rounded the last corner and came to a stop outside the building. It looked different now. The four-story structure loomed against the night sky, its windows dark, its edges jagged like a crooked spine. The cold, lifeless air hung heavy, and Graham shivered as he stepped out of the truck. The manila folder still sat on the seat, the printed file barely peeking out from the edge, but he ignored it now. He didn't need the words anymore. The truth was pulling him inside like a hook buried deep in his chest. His boots echoed as he climbed the front steps and pulled open the door. The hallway inside was darker than usual, the overhead lights flickering weakly as though struggling to stay alive. Each step forward felt heavier, like the building itself was pressing against him. He stopped at the foot of the staircase, staring up into the gloom. The fourth floor was waiting for him. Graham swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He didn't want to go up there, but his body moved before his mind could stop it. One step, then another. The creaking of the stairs beneath his weight sounded like whispers, muttering words he couldn't quite understand. By the time he reached the fourth floor, his legs felt like lead, every muscle tensed. The hallway stretched before him, longer than he remembered, darker than it should have been. The door to 4C stood at the end, the number plate crooked, as though it had been pried off and hastily nailed back into place. Graham walked toward it slowly, his footsteps deliberate, his heart hammering so loudly he thought it might shatter his ribs. He reached the door and stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain. It was too quiet up here, no creaking pipes, no murmurs from other units, just silence. He reached out and knocked. Once, twice, nothing. He turned the knob slowly. It gave way easily, the door swinging inward with a faint creak. The room was just as it had been earlier, dim, empty except for the wooden chair by the window and the small table beside it. The mug still sat on the sill, though its surface was now covered in dust, as though no one had touched it in years. The faint hum he'd heard before had returned, a low vibration that seemed to seep through the walls. And there, in the chair, sat Charles Miller, or Elon Musk. The man's silhouette was sharp against the window, the faint glow of the city outside painting him in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak, but Graham could feel his eyes, calm, unshakable, watching him. Graham's voice cracked as he finally found the strength to speak. "Why are you doing this?" Miller tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured in darkness. "You already know why." "No, I don't," Graham snapped, his anger rising like bile. "I don't know who you are, and I don't know what you want from me. I'm not some big shot. You've got no reason to be here." Miller didn't flinch. "It's not about what I want, Graham. It's about what you've done." Graham's pulse quickened. He took a step forward, his fists trembling at his sides. "Stop saying that. Stop playing games. You want to ruin my life? Is that it? You want to mess with me? Make me look like a fool?" Miller finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You think I'm here to ruin you? You are ruining me," Graham shouted, his voice raw. "The calls, the messages, the file. I don't even know how you're doing it." Miller fell silent for a moment, as though considering Graham's words. Then he leaned forward slightly, his face finally catching the faint light from the window. His expression was calm, as always, but now Graham could see something deeper in his eyes, something ancient, as though Miller had seen more than one lifetime could contain. "I'm not ruining you, Graham," Miller said softly. "I'm here because you ruined yourself." Graham's mouth went dry. "You cut corners," Miller continued, his voice even. "Ignored repairs. Turned a blind eye when people begged you for help. The pipes in this building are older than you are, but you let them rot because fixing them would cost too much. And when it finally caught up to you, When the ceiling caved in and that woman begged for your help, you didn't lift a finger. Graham staggered back, his head spinning as the memories came rushing forward like floodwaters breaking through a dam. The ceiling, the leak, the family in 4C, the woman, her voice hoarse, pleading with him to do something, to fix what he'd ignored for years. He hadn't. He'd ignored the calls, ignored the warnings. He told himself it wasn't his problem. And then the little girl, her face pale, lifeless, covered in dust as the medics carried her out. Graham shook his head violently, his hands trembling. No, that wasn't my fault. It wasn't. Miller didn't move. Say her name, Graham. Graham's throat constricted. He couldn't breathe. I didn't mean. Say her name. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pulsing with the weight of what he'd done. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards, through his bones, until it felt like it would split him apart. Say her name. Emily. Graham choked out, the word tearing from his throat like glass. The hum stopped. Miller sat back in the chair, his expression unreadable. Now you understand. Graham staggered, his knees nearly giving out as the truth finally crashed over him. He had buried it, ignored it, told himself it didn't matter, that no one could pin it on him. But the guilt had never gone away. And now Charles Miller, Elon Musk, was here dragging it into the light. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily. Graham staggered backward, his body slamming into the wall as though the word had physically struck him. The room seemed to pulse and tilt, the faint hum that had haunted him all day now gone, leaving only a heavy, oppressive silence. The air felt thick, as though the walls were closing in, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He shook his head violently, his breath ragged. You don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his voice trembling. This is insane. You don't know me. You don't know anything about what happened. Miller sat still, his face expressionless, the calm lines of his features sharper now in the faint light spilling through the window. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. If anything, there was a strange sadness in his eyes, a quiet, knowing weight that unsettled Graham more than fury ever could. I know everything, Graham, Miller said softly. I know what you did. I know how you've lied to yourself. I know how you watched her family beg for help and turned your back. I know you chose not to care. No, Graham roared, slamming his fist against the wall. I didn't turn my back. It wasn't my fault. That ceiling was old. No one could have known it would come down. No one. Miller's gaze never wavered. You knew, he said quietly. You knew about the leaks. You knew about the cracks. You knew about the danger, and you chose to do nothing. Graham opened his mouth to argue, to shout, to deny it all. But he couldn't. The memories, the ones he'd buried so deeply they almost felt like dreams, clawed their way to the surface. The calls, the complaints, the small family in 4C, the mother holding her daughter close, her voice tight with desperation as she pleaded for him to fix the ceiling. It's leaking everywhere. Please, sir. It's dripping onto my daughter's bed. And Graham, standing in that same doorway, arms crossed, his voice dismissive. Not my problem. I don't have the money for it. You'll just have to deal with it. He'd turned his back on her. He'd walked away. And then, weeks later, the ceiling had given in. The plaster and wood had caved like wet paper, crashing onto the little girl's bed. Graham hadn't seen it happen. He'd been safe at home, ignoring the panicked calls that lit up his phone. By the time he'd finally arrived, it was too late. Emily, her small, lifeless form had been carried out of the building by the medics, her mother's wails echoing through the hallway. Graham had stood there on the sidewalk, numb, telling himself over and over that it wasn't his fault. The ceiling was old. The building was old. It had been an accident, a tragedy, but nothing more. He'd convinced himself he couldn't have done anything differently. But deep down, he'd always known the truth. You let her die, Graham, Miller said, his voice a soft whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. You chose greed over responsibility. You let the cracks grow, you let the water seep in, and you let that little girl pay the price for it. Stop, Graham shouted, his voice raw and desperate. You don't know what it's like. You think it's easy running a place like this? You think I'm some kind of monster? Miller didn't flinch. You made yourself into one. The words hit Graham like a punch to the gut. He staggered forward, his legs trembling as he sank to his knees in the center of the room. The weight of it all crashed over him. Years of denial unraveling in an instant, the truth breaking through the cracks he tried to plaster over. I didn't mean for it to happen, he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for her to. But it did, Miller said gently. And you've been running from it ever since. Graham buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the guilt he'd locked away for so long finally clawed its way free. The quiet of the room pressed against him, suffocating, the walls seeming to pulse in time with the pounding of his heart. I didn't want this, he choked. I swear, I didn't. Miller rose slowly from the chair, his movements deliberate, the scrape of the wooden legs against the floor echoing through the room. Graham felt him approach but couldn't bring himself to look up. It was as though Miller's presence carried the full weight of everything he'd tried to bury, dragging Graham down with it. I told you, Graham, Miller said softly, standing over him. You can't outrun this. It always catches up. Graham looked up finally, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Why are you here? Why you? You're Elon Musk, you're a billionaire. What do you want with me? Miller's expression remained calm, unreadable, but there was something in his gaze now, something ancient and knowing, as though he could see straight through Graham's soul. I'm not here for revenge, Miller said quietly. I'm here for the truth, for justice, for her. Graham's breath hitched. For her? Miller nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily deserved to be remembered. Her family deserved answers. You buried the truth, Graham, but the cracks you ignored in that ceiling were nothing compared to the cracks in yourself. You let greed rot you from the inside out, and now you've run out of places to hide. Graham shook his head frantically, scrambling backward, his back hitting the wall. What do you want from me? Miller crouched down, his face close now, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. I want you to admit it, he said softly. I want you to say the words out loud. Graham stared at him, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Say it, Graham. The silence stretched between them, suffocating, until finally, Graham's voice broke through. I let her die, he whispered, his voice trembling. It was my fault. I let her die. The words left him like a flood, ripping through the last barriers he'd built around himself. He sagged forward, his forehead hitting the floor as sobs racked his body, his guilt pouring out into the emptiness of the room. Miller stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the floor as he turned toward the window. It's done now, he said softly. The room felt different suddenly, lighter, though Graham didn't notice. He stayed on the floor, broken, the truth sitting heavy in the air around him. From outside, the faint sound of sirens drifted through the window. The sirens grew louder, rising from the streets below like an inevitability. The faint wail, distant at first, crept through the open window, twisting around Graham's heaving breaths. He stayed slumped on the floor, forehead pressed against the grimy wood as though he could somehow disappear into it, escape the weight that pinned him there. I let her die. The words hung in the silence, echoing in his ears long after he'd spoken them. Saying them hadn't lifted the burden. It had made it worse. It had made it real. He'd cracked the seal on something he couldn't push back down, something that had festered inside him for far too long. The room was cold now, colder than it had been before, as though the building itself had swallowed his confession. Graham blinked hard, staring at the floorboards through sweat-blurred eyes. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything except the sound of his own broken breathing. He didn't dare look up. Not at the chair, not at the window, and definitely not at him. The sirens were closer now, filling the air with their sharp, shrill cry. Why? Graham croaked, his voice raw. Why now? After all these years, There was no immediate answer. For a long, stretched-out moment, the room remained quiet, save for the faint buzz of the city outside. Then, the voice came, not soft this time, but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Because it's time, Graham." Graham looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, searching for Miller in the gloom. But the chair was empty. The mug on the sill sat undisturbed, dust clinging to its edges, and the faint hum that had filled the room earlier was gone. "Miller," he whispered, his voice trembling. The apartment was empty, and yet he still felt watched. The sirens blared suddenly, so close they seemed to be directly below him. Graham scrambled to his feet, clutching the edge of the table for balance as he stumbled to the window. He wiped the glass with his sleeve, squinting through the smudges and grime. Down below, 2 police cruisers sat parked at the curb, their lights flashing in jarring red and blue streaks that painted the front of the building. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, neighbors, passers-by, all craning their necks to see what was happening. Graham's stomach turned to stone. "Why are they here?" he muttered, panic clawing at his throat. He turned sharply toward the door, but something caught his eye before he could move. The suitcase, Miller's suitcase, sat open in the corner of the room where it had been before. But now, a single photograph lay on top of the tangled wires and strange black device. Graham's hands shook as he crossed the room and crouched down, his fingers trembling as he picked up the photo. It was Emily. The little girl's face stared up at him, frozen in time. Her smile was soft and bright, her eyes filled with the kind of innocent joy Graham had forgotten existed. She couldn't have been more than 6. His chest tightened, his vision swimming. He turned the photo over, his breath catching as he saw the words scrawled on the back in neat, careful handwriting. She deserved better. The photo slipped from Graham's hand and fluttered to the floor. His knees gave out, and he sagged against the wall, his head pounding, the air too thick to breathe. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway outside. Heavy boots, deliberate and slow. Graham's head snapped up, his heart hammering as the footsteps grew closer. They stopped outside the door. A sharp knock broke the silence. Graham flinched, his body jolting violently as the sound reverberated through the room. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, deep, commanding and unfamiliar. "Police! Open the door!" Graham scrambled to his feet, his mind spinning. Police? Why? Who had called them? He stumbled toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the knob. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice desperate. "You don't understand." The door burst open before he could finish, the hinges groaning as 2 officers stepped into the room. Graham staggered backward, his arms raised instinctively as their flashlights swept over him, bathing him in harsh white light. "Mr. Nichols?" one of the officers said, his voice clipped and professional. Graham's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "We received multiple calls," the officer continued, his eyes scanning the room. "Witnesses reported strange activity in this unit. A man seen coming and going. Someone who doesn't exist in our records." He gestured to Graham sharply. "And we need to talk to you." Graham shook his head frantically, the words tumbling out of him. "I don't know what you're talking about. There was someone here, he was here. He called himself Charles Miller. The officer's flashlight swept the room, landing on the empty chair by the window. "There's no one here, Mr. Nichols," he said flatly. Graham's chest seized. "He was just here. You have to believe me. He's not who he says he is. He's Elon Musk." The second officer shot his partner a glance, one eyebrow raised. "Musk?" Graham froze as the words left his mouth. They sounded ridiculous, even to him. "Sir, I think you need to come with us," the first officer said, stepping forward, his voice firm but calm. "We're going to have you answer some questions." Graham stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room. The chair sat empty. The suitcase was gone. Even the photograph had vanished. "No," he breathed. "No, he was here. I saw him. Sir," the officer interrupted, his voice sharp. Calm down. You're not making any sense." The words hit Graham like a slap, knocking the wind out of him. Not making sense. Of course he wasn't making sense. None of this made sense. The calls, the messages, the vanished paperwork. It was like the entire world had conspired to make him look insane. "Please," Graham whispered, his voice barely audible. "You have to believe me. You have to." The officer grabbed his arm gently but firmly, guiding him toward the door. Graham didn't resist. He couldn't. His legs moved mechanically, his mind spinning like a broken record. As they led him out into the hallway, his head turned instinctively, his gaze falling back toward the window of 4C. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow standing there, tall, still, unmoving. But when he blinked, it was gone. The hallway seemed longer now, darker, the shadows stretching endlessly as the officers led him down the stairs. The crowd outside had grown larger, their faces blurred and distant as Graham was ushered toward the waiting police car. The red and blue lights flashed across the crumbling building, painting the facade in jarring streaks of color. Graham sank into the back seat of the car, his shoulders slumped, his hands limp in his lap. As the door closed and the car pulled away, his gaze lifted to the fourth-floor window one last time. And there, standing in the faint glow of the city lights, was Charles Miller. Or Elon Musk. Graham couldn't tell anymore. The shadow watched him as the car disappeared into the night, its presence heavy and unrelenting. Like the truth Graham could no longer escape. The car jolted slightly as it turned onto the main road, the low hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence inside the cabin. Graham sat slumped in the back seat, his eyes vacant, his face pale and slick with sweat. The flashing red and blue lights outside played across his reflection in the window, casting fleeting streaks of color across his hollow features. He didn't fight anymore. The officers in the front seat spoke quietly to each other, their voices muffled and distant, as though they were miles away. Graham's head hung low, his shoulders sagging as he stared at his hands. Calloused, trembling, empty. He had nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to fight for. The truth was out now. He'd said her name, Emily. He'd spoken the words out loud, broken and fragile, and now they echoed in his mind, refusing to let him forget. The little girl's face swam before his eyes, smiling in the photo, lifeless in his memory, and it felt as though the guilt he'd buried for so long had finally broken him apart. "I let her die." He whispered it again, so softly it was barely audible, as though the words themselves hurt to say. The officer in the passenger seat glanced back, his brow furrowed. "What was that, Mr. Nichols?" Graham didn't answer. He kept his gaze locked on his trembling hands. The police car slowed, its tires crunching softly against gravel as it pulled into the lot of the small precinct downtown. The lights outside were bright, harsh against the darkness of the night, and the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs buzzed through the air as Graham was led inside. The officers didn't treat him roughly, they didn't need to. Graham moved without resistance, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as they guided him down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room. The walls were bare, the light overhead casting a stark, unflattering glow on the single metal table at the center. "Take a seat," one of the officers instructed, gesturing toward the chair. Graham did as he was told, sinking into the cold metal with the weight of a man who'd given up. "We'll be back in a minute," the officer said, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Graham didn't move. He didn't even blink. The room felt like a vacuum, silent and still, the sound of his breathing the only thing breaking the quiet. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he buried his face in his hands. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, it was all over. The building, the tenants, the money, none of it mattered anymore. None of it had ever mattered. His thoughts spiraled, tumbling back to that day. The ceiling caving in, the sound of the wood splintering like thunder, the mother's screams, raw and unrelenting, the medics arriving too late, carrying the little girl out wrapped in a white sheet. Her name had been Emily. He told himself for years that it wasn't his fault, that accidents happened, that he'd done what he could. But it had been a lie. One he'd told himself over and over until he'd almost believed it, until Charles Miller had shown up, or whoever he was. The thought pulled Graham's head up sharply, his bloodshot eyes scanning the empty room. Miller, Elon Musk. The name felt surreal now, absurd in the face of everything that had happened. A billionaire hiding in his building, haunting his every step. It didn't make sense. But what if it didn't need to make sense? What if Miller wasn't just a man? Graham let out a shaky breath, the thought clawing its way through his fractured mind. What if Miller had been something else entirely? Something sent to remind him, to drag him back to the truth. Justice, guilt, punishment. Graham didn't know anymore. All he knew was that he'd been followed, watched, and judged. And in the end, he'd been broken. The door creaked open, pulling Graham from his thoughts. The same officer from earlier stepped inside, carrying a folder. He dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud, and Graham flinched at the sound. "Mr. Nichols," the officer began, sliding into the chair across from him. "We've got some questions." Graham looked up slowly, his gaze empty. "I've already told you everything." The officer ignored him, opening the folder and flipping through its contents. "Witnesses report you've been acting erratically over the last few days, disturbing neighbors, trespassing in your own building, talking about a tenant, Charles Miller, who, according to our records, doesn't exist." Graham blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What?" The officer slid a piece of paper across the table. "We checked the building. Unit 4C has been empty for over a year. No lease, no tenant, no record of anyone named Charles Miller." Graham's mouth went dry. He stared at the paper, the words swimming in front of him. "Empty. No tenant." "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, he was there. I saw him. He spoke to me. He showed me the file. The messages." "What messages?" The officer interrupted sharply. Graham faltered, his hands trembling as he tried to piece the words together. "The phone calls, the texts, the file. It said Project 12, and..." The officer watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. "There was no file in the apartment, Mr. Nichols. There was nothing there at all." Graham's chest tightened. His mind raced, stumbling over itself as he tried to make sense of the officer's words. "No file, no tenant, no Miller." The officer leaned back, his gaze steady. "Mr. Nichols, do you know what happened in that building a year ago?" Graham froze. "A family lived in Unit 4C, the officer continued. A mother and her daughter. The girl died when the ceiling collapsed. The mother said she'd warned the landlord for months, but nothing was ever done." The room tilted around Graham as the words sank in. The truth he could no longer escape, tightening its grip on him like a noose. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't." The officer closed the folder and stood, his expression grim. "Sometimes, Mr. Nichols, the past doesn't let us go." He left the room without another word, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Graham sat there alone, the silence pressing down on him like the weight of the entire world. He stared at the empty wall, his mind blank, the edges of his thoughts unraveling. And then, faintly, so faintly he almost missed it, he heard the hum, that same low, vibrating hum, crawling up through the floorboards, settling into the air like a presence. Graham's breath hitched. He looked up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. In the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, stood a figure. Tall, still, watching. The hum was faint at first, so low it seemed to vibrate beneath the skin, pulling at the edges of Graham's shattered mind. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He just sat there, his body frozen as the shadow in the corner grew sharper, more defined, until it stepped fully into the pale light of the interrogation room. It was him, Charles Miller, or Elon Musk, or something in between. Miller stood perfectly still, his face calm as always, the faint trace of a smile playing at his lips. There was no arrogance in his expression, no anger, just quiet certainty, as though everything had played out exactly as it was always meant to. "You," Graham whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "You're not real. Miller tilted his head slightly, the movement slow, deliberate. Aren't I? Graham's heart pounded so hard it felt like his ribs might crack. They said you don't exist. They said 4C is empty. Miller didn't blink. They're not wrong. The words hit Graham like a slap. Then who? What are you? Miller stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the floor, enveloping the cold metal table. I told you, Graham, I'm here for the truth, for justice, for her, Emily. Graham flinched at the unspoken name, his face contorting as the guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave. Why me? He choked. Why now? Miller's gaze softened, though it only made him more unsettling. Because you could never outrun it. The cracks were always there, Graham, beneath the ceiling, beneath the surface. You let them grow, and now they've swallowed you whole. Graham shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean for her to die. I didn't. But you didn't stop it either, Miller said gently. And that's the truth you've been running from all along. The hum grew louder now, vibrating through the room, filling Graham's ears, his head, his chest. It was everywhere. He pressed his hands to his temples, his body trembling, as Miller's words swam through his mind. The past doesn't let us go. The room darkened, the light above flickering violently as shadows clawed at the corners. Graham fell to his knees, his sobs raw and unrelenting, his guilt pouring out of him in a torrent he couldn't stop. For the first time, he let himself feel it. The weight of what he'd done, the life he'd let slip away, the family he'd left broken in the wreckage. And then silence. The hum vanished. The light steadied. The room returned to stillness. When Graham finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, the room was empty. The shadow in the corner was gone. Miller was gone. Only Graham remained, kneeling on the cold floor, surrounded by nothing but silence. The sun was rising when they let him go. The officer said nothing as Graham walked out of the precinct, his steps slow and deliberate, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of something he couldn't describe. He didn't argue, didn't explain. What was there left to say? The street outside was empty, bathed in soft, golden light that cast long shadows across the pavement. Graham shoved his hands into his pockets and walked without direction. His mind hollow, his body moving on instinct alone. When he reached the building, he stopped. The facade looked the same as it always had, crumbling, weathered, forgotten. The windows stared blankly down at him, dark and lifeless. But somehow it felt different now. It felt heavier. Graham stepped inside, the familiar creak of the door breaking the stillness. The hallway smelled of mildew and dust, the air heavy with memory. He climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, until he reached the 4th floor. The door to 4C stood at the end of the hall, just as it had before. Graham walked toward it, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. When he turned it, the door opened easily. The room was empty. No chair, no mug, no hum, just dust and light filtering through the window. He stepped inside, his boots leaving faint tracks on the wooden floor. The weight of the past hung thick in the air, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was quieter now, like a wound that had finally been exposed to the light. Graham crossed the room and sank to his knees in front of the window. For a long time, he sat there in silence, staring at the city beyond. The hum was gone, the shadow was gone, but the truth remained. Emily had deserved better. And maybe, just maybe, Graham could start to make that right. Days later, the building was sold. No one knew why. The landlord, once feared, once stubborn, had handed over the deed without argument, disappearing into quiet anonymity. The building's new owners began renovations immediately, patching the cracks, fixing the pipes, tearing down what couldn't be saved. The 4th floor was remodeled first. Unit 4C was stripped down to the studs, the ceiling reinforced, the walls replaced. No one mentioned the girl who'd once lived there or the tragedy that had occurred. But some nights, the neighbors swore they heard something. Just a faint hum, low and steady, vibrating through the floorboards like an echo of something that had been buried. And in the quiet, empty space where a little girl's bed had once been, a single photograph was found, dusty, faded, but intact. The image showed a smiling girl, no older than 6. On the back, in careful handwriting, were 3 words: "She deserved better." The neighborhood had been quiet since the building changed hands. Rumors swirled about the sale. Some said Graham Nichols had gone mad. Others whispered he'd been pressured into giving it up, though no one could explain by who. Either way, no one saw him around anymore. He'd vanished, leaving behind a building with fresh owners and fresh paint. The cracked facade had been smoothed, the peeling ceilings replaced, and the 4th floor, for C, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. But Graham hadn't vanished completely. Days bled into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, but his guilt didn't fade. He'd moved into a small, nameless apartment on the edge of town, far from his old building, far from everything. The place was barely furnished. A cot, a table, a single lamp, but it didn't matter. He spent his days in silence, staring at the cracked ceiling, the hum of his cheap refrigerator buzzing faintly in the background. Most nights, he didn't sleep. When he did, he dreamed of her, Emily. The little girl stared at him from across the room, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes empty and accusing. She never said a word, but she didn't have to. Graham always woke drenched in sweat. Her image burned into his mind like a scar. And sometimes, when the nights were too quiet, when the walls of his new place felt like they were pressing in on him, he heard it. The hum. It would start faintly, barely audible, crawling up through the floorboards and into the walls. Graham would sit up in his cot, his breath catching, his eyes wide as he scanned the empty room. He always told himself it was nothing, just the pipes or the fridge or his mind playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew. He was never alone. One evening, weeks after he'd disappeared from the world, Graham sat at his small table, nursing a cup of cheap coffee. The sun was setting outside, washing the room in hues of orange and gold, but it brought him no comfort. The knock at the door startled him. It was sharp, deliberate, 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Graham froze, his heart skipping. No one ever came here. No one knew where he lived. He rose slowly, the chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the door. His fingers hovered over the doorknob, hesitant. For a long moment, he stood there, listening to the silence on the other side. Knock, knock, knock. Graham swallowed hard, his throat dry. Finally, he turned the lock and pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. No footsteps, no sounds. Just shadows stretching across the floor and fading light streaming through a cracked window. Graham stared for a moment, his breath hitching. And then, slowly, he looked down. A small envelope sat at his feet. He bent to pick it up, his hands trembling as he turned it over. There was no address, no stamp, just his name scrawled across the front in neat, careful handwriting. Graham. He stepped back into the apartment and shut the door quickly, the click of the lock echoing louder than it should have. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. At first, it looked blank, but when he tilted it under the light, faint words appeared, written in almost translucent ink. The cracks are sealed. But what about you? Graham staggered back, the paper fluttering to the floor. The hum started again, faint, distant, vibrating through the walls. He pressed his hands over his ears, his breath coming fast and shallow. No, no, no. The hum grew louder, louder, until it was all he could hear, filling the room, rattling his bones. He sank to his knees, his mind spinning, Emily's face flashing before his eyes. Her smile, her small hands clutching her mother's as they begged him to fix what he'd ignored. It wasn't my fault, he whispered desperately, his voice shaking. I didn't mean to. The hum stopped. The room fell silent. Graham looked up, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. The paper still lay on the floor, the words faint but unrelenting. The cracks are sealed. But what about you? Graham sat on the floor, the paper still lying in front of him, its faint words gleaming under the dim light. He didn't dare touch it. It sat there like a curse, like it would burn his skin if he tried to pick it up. The cracks are sealed. But what about you? His breath came in shallow gasps. his eyes fixed on the note as though it might move or shift under his gaze. The silence in the room wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, heavy, oppressive. And then, as it always did, the hum returned. At first, it was faint, like an itch at the back of his mind. Graham sat perfectly still, his body rigid, his ears straining. But it grew louder, not sharp or violent, just constant. The words tore through him again, and suddenly he knew. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding from what he'd done. The street blurred as he quickened his pace, his breath sharp and ragged as he finally turned back in the direction he'd come from. His building, his mistake, the place where it had all started. By the time Graham reached the building, the night had grown colder, the wind whipping through the empty streets. The facade loomed ahead of him, freshly painted but no less imposing. The windows reflected the pale glow of the streetlights, dark and lifeless. Graham stood at the base of the steps, staring up at the 4th floor. The window to 4C was dark. His feet felt like lead as he climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The building was silent, too silent, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for him. When he reached the 4th floor, the hallway stretched out before him, long and empty. The door to 4C stood at the end, just as it always had, the number plate slightly crooked. Graham walked toward it, his footsteps loud in the stillness. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, but he didn't stop. He reached the door and pressed his hand against it, feeling the cold wood beneath his palm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The hum returned, faint and familiar, vibrating softly through the walls. It wasn't angry, wasn't cruel, just steady, like a heartbeat. Graham turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was empty. No chair, no suitcase, no mug. But as Graham sank to his knees in the center of the floor, he felt it, the presence he'd been running from. It wasn't Miller anymore. It wasn't anyone. It was him, his guilt, his choices, the cracks he'd let grow until they'd swallowed everything. The hum swelled, filling the air around him, vibrating through the floors and walls until it was all he could hear. Graham closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he let it wash over him. And for the first time, he didn't fight it. The building was quiet now. The 4th floor, once a place of echoes and restless shadows, sat still and empty. The walls had been repainted, the ceiling repaired, the cracks in the plaster sealed. Fresh light fixtures hummed softly in the hallway, casting steady pools of white across the clean floors. From the outside, it looked like any other apartment building, ordinary, unremarkable, whole. But inside, something lingered. No one ever rented Unit 4C. The new owners listed it time and time again, but no tenants stayed. Prospective renters would tour the unit, nodding politely at the clean lines and freshly painted walls. But they always hesitated, their steps slowing as they reached the center of the room. They couldn't explain why. Some said it felt cold. Others said it was too quiet, like the room was holding its breath. A faint hum could sometimes be heard, soft and distant, vibrating through the walls. It was almost comforting, they said, but not quite. And so the room stayed empty. Months later, on a cloudy autumn afternoon, a reporter arrived at the building. She was young, with a notepad tucked under her arm and a curiosity that hadn't yet been beaten down by years on the job. The building's history had caught her attention. Rumors of tragedy, whispers of a landlord's breakdown, stories of a billionaire hiding in plain sight. It was too strange to ignore. She pushed the button for the 4th floor and waited, the old elevator groaning as it carried her upward. The doors opened with a faint creak, and she stepped into the quiet hallway. At the end, Unit 4C waited. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing softly against the freshly polished floor. The door looked no different from any of the others. Just another number, slightly crooked, nailed above the frame. The reporter knocked gently. There was no response. Of course there wasn't. The room was empty. She reached for the doorknob and turned it, surprised to find it unlocked. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a space bathed in the soft gray light filtering through the window. It was just a room, For walls, a window, a floor. And yet, she hesitated in the doorway, her chest tightening with an unease she couldn't explain. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes sweeping the empty space. The hum was faint here, so soft she might have imagined it. The reporter walked toward the window, where she paused, staring out at the city below. The air in the room felt thick, like a held breath. She flipped open her notepad and began scribbling, glancing back occasionally as though she expected someone to be there. But she was alone, or so she thought. She turned to leave, but something caught her eye near the corner of the room. A single object sat on the floor, half hidden in the shadow cast by the window frame. It wasn't there when she'd entered. She was sure of it. Frowning, she bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph. The edges were worn, the surface slightly faded, but the image was clear. A little girl, no older than 6, stared back at her with a soft, innocent smile. The reporter's chest tightened as she turned the photo over. There, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, were 3 words. She deserved better. She stood frozen, the hum in the walls growing just a little louder. In a quiet corner of a distant cemetery, beneath a weathered oak tree, a simple headstone marked the final resting place of Emily Bennett. The flowers left there were always fresh, lilies mostly, and no one ever saw who brought them. No one except the groundskeeper. He'd seen a man once, an older figure in a worn coat, his shoulders slumped, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He never stayed long, just stood there in silence before leaving without a word. The groundskeeper never asked his name, but when he cleaned the site later, he always found a note. 3 words. "I'm so sorry." The world moved on as it always does. The building changed hands again. Repainted, rebranded. Its history buried beneath fresh coats of color and new tenants who knew nothing of what had come before. But some things linger. On quiet nights, when the air was still and the city's hum faded to a whisper, a faint vibration could be heard from the walls of Unit 4C. Some tenants said it was the pipes, others thought it was the wind, but no one could explain why it always sounded like a heartbeat, or why it never quite stopped. The past doesn't disappear. It doesn't let itself be buried, no matter how deep you try to hide it. It lingers, vibrating through the cracks, waiting patiently for the truth to surface. In the end, Graham Nichols learned that lesson too late. But maybe, just maybe, Emily's name would never be forgotten.